The monster of the Andes, Pedro Alonso Lopez, the world's most prolific serial killer. Pedro Alonso Lopez, often called the monster of the Andes, is one of the most horrifying and prolific serial killers in history, responsible for the deaths of hundreds of young girls across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. His killing spree began in the 1970s, and by the time he was finally captured, Lopez had confessed to the murders of more than 300 girls. What makes his story particularly chilling is that, despite his heinous crimes, Lopez was released from prison and disappeared. His whereabouts remain unknown. This terrifying true story is one of unimaginable horror and continues to haunt South America to this day. A childhood of abuse and violence. Pedro Alonso Lopez was born on October 8, 1948, in Santa Isabel, Colombia. His childhood was marked by extreme poverty, abuse, and trauma. His mother was a prostitute who frequently brought clients into their home, and Lopez was exposed to violence and sexual abuse from a young age. By the age of 8, Lopez had been caught fondling his younger sister and was thrown out of the house by his mother. Homeless and alone, Lopez wandered the streets, begging and stealing to survive. His time on the streets was brutal, and he was soon kidnapped by a man who sexually assaulted him repeatedly. After escaping his abuser, Lopez became even more hardened and embittered, developing a deep hatred towards society. As a teenager, Lopez was sent to prison for stealing cars, and it was here that his hatred toward women began to take shape. In prison, Lopez was gang raped by fellow inmates, but he later claimed that he killed the men responsible. This event marked a turning point in his life, after which he would embark on one of the most horrifying killing sprees in modern history. The killing spree begins after being released from prison. Lopez began traveling across South America, targeting young girls between the ages of 8 and 12. He lured his victims away from busy streets, offering them gifts or promising them work. Once he had gained their trust, he would take them to remote locations where he would rape and strangle them. Lopez's killing spree spanned multiple countries, including Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. His method was terrifyingly consistent. After gaining his victims' trust, he would lead them to isolated spots in the countryside, rape them, and then strangle them, often while looking them in the eyes. He referred to his murders as an art, and his preferred victims were young girls because he believed their innocence made them the perfect prey. In many cases, he buried the bodies of his victims in shallow graves, sometimes returning to the sites later to relive the murders. Lopez claimed that he killed more than 100 girls in Ecuador alone, another 100 in Colombia, and at least 100 more in Peru. He was able to move freely between countries, exploiting the lack of communication between law enforcement agencies. Despite the growing number of missing girls, authorities were slow to realize that a serial killer was on the loose. In rural areas, police often dismissed the disappearances as runaways or trafficking victims, unaware that a single man was responsible for the growing death toll. The capture of the monster. Lopez's reign of terror came to an end in 1980 when a flash flood in Ecuador uncovered the bodies of 4 of his victims. The discovery shocked the local authorities, who launched an investigation. Around the same time, Lopez was caught trying to abduct a 12-year-old girl in Ecuador. Her mother alerted the police, and Lopez was finally arrested. At first, Lopez denied everything, but after days of interrogation, he began to confess. His confession was chilling. He claimed to have killed more than 300 girls and even led the police to several mass graves where he had buried his victims. In total, authorities were able to recover the bodies of 53 young girls, though Lopez insisted that there were many more. What made Lopez's confession even more horrifying was the lack of remorse he showed. He described his killings with cold detachment, referring to his victims as objects of pleasure. He expressed no guilt or regret, claiming that he had done the world a favor by ridding it of future prostitutes. A shocking release in 1983, Lopez was convicted of 110 murders in Ecuador and sentenced to life in prison. However, due to Ecuador's lenient legal system, he served just 14 years before being released in 1994 for good behavior. Lopez's release shocked the world, but under Ecuadorian law, this was the maximum sentence he could receive. After his release, Lopez was deported to Colombia, where he was briefly imprisoned for a previous murder. Incredibly, Lopez was declared sane and was released from prison after just a few years. Authorities attempted to track him after his release, but in 1998, he simply disappeared. Lopez's current whereabouts are unknown, and it is feared that he may have resumed his killing spree. Some reports suggest that he may have been killed by vigilantes, but these claims have never been confirmed. He remains one of the most wanted fugitives in the world. The legacy of the monster of the Andes, Pedro Alonso Lopez, is believed to be one of the most prolific serial killers in history, with a confirmed kill count of at least 110 girls and claims of up to 300 murders. Despite his horrifying crimes, he was released from prison after serving just a fraction of his sentence, and has never been brought to justice. Lopez's story remains one of the most disturbing and chilling examples of serial killing, not only because of the scale of his crimes but also because of the systemic failures that allowed him to evade justice for so long. His release from prison shocked the world, and the fact that he remains at large continues to haunt the families of his victims. The case of Pedro Alonso Lopez is a grim reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a seemingly unremarkable facade and the terrible consequences when justice fails to prevail. This true story of Pedro Alonso Lopez, the monster of the Andes.